They said I was selfish for wanting to live alone at 28. What they didn't expect was just how selfish I could actually be when they handed me the keys to their $1 million lakefront dream home. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. The Sunday dinner table at my parents' house in Millbrook had become a battlefield, and I was losing every week. The mahogany dining room that once felt warm and inviting now felt like a courtroom where I was perpetually on trial. My mother, Patricia Whitmore, had perfected the art of the disappointed sigh, while my father, Robert, preferred the direct approach of heavy-handed lectures about family values and responsibility. "Madison, you're being ridiculous," my older sister Caroline announced, cutting into her pot roast with the same precision she used to dissect my life choices. "You make $42,000 a year as a graphic designer. You can barely afford that shoebox apartment in downtown Cedar Falls, and you're refusing to move back home where you could save money and help mom and dad with the house." I set down my fork, trying to maintain the composure I'd been practicing all week. "I'm not refusing to help. I've offered to contribute financially while living independently. There's a difference between helping a family and being treated like I'm still 16. My younger brother Derek laughed, not looking up from his phone. "Independent? You call eating ramen noodles 4 nights a week and driving a car that breaks down every other month independent? That's just stubborn pride, Maddie." "It's not about the money," I said, though we all knew it partly was. "It's about being an adult and making my own choices without having to justify every decision to a committee." Patricia's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down with theatrical precision. "Choices? Madison, sweetie, what you're doing isn't making choices. It's being selfish." Family sticks together. When your grandmother was your age, she was already married with 2 children and helping run the family farm. This obsession with living alone is just, it's selfish. The word hung in the air like smoke. It had become their favorite weapon against me over the past 6 months since I'd moved out of the family home into my cramped 1-bedroom apartment. According to them, wanting privacy was selfish. Preferring my own schedule was not wanting to share a bathroom with my 26-year-old brother who still left his dirty clothes on the floor was apparently the height of selfish behavior. "You know what's selfish?" I said, feeling heat rise in my cheek, expecting me to put my life on hold indefinitely because it's more convenient for everyone else. "I'm 28 years old, not 18. I work full-time. I pay my bills. I don't ask you for money. How exactly is that selfish?" Robert cleared his throat, which was his signal that he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom. "Madison, we're not asking you to put your life on hold. We're asking you to be practical. You're throwing money away on rent when you could be saving for a house, for your future. And your mother could use help around here with the garden, the cooking, the maintenance projects." "I've offered to help with projects on weekends," I reminded him for the 100th time. "But somehow that's never enough. It always comes back to moving home, giving up my independence, and falling back into the same patterns we had when I was in high school." Caroline rolled her eyes dramatically. "Independence, you keep saying that word like it means something. What's independent about living paycheck to paycheck in a building where the heat doesn't work half the time? What's independent about being a grown woman who can't even paint her bedroom walls without asking permission?" I shot back. "Or having to explain where I'm going every time I leave the house, or listening to lectures about my life choices every Sunday." "Nobody lectures you," Derek said, finally looking up from his phone with a smirk. "We just point out when you're making bad decisions. There's a difference." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. Like when Mom pointed out that my job wasn't stable enough for someone my age, or when Dad mentioned that I should be thinking about settling down instead of playing house by myself, or when you suggested that my priorities were screwed up because I spent money on art supplies instead of saving every penny." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. This same conversation had been happening in various forms for months, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like something was going to break. Patricia's voice took on that patient, condescending tone that made my teeth clench. "Honey, we're not trying to control your life. We're trying to help you see that what you think is independence is actually just stubbornness. And frankly, it's selfish to struggle unnecessarily when you have a family who wants to help you. Selfish, I repeated slowly. Interesting choice of words, Mom. Well, what would you call it? Caroline chimed in. You're so focused on proving some point about living alone that you're making life harder for yourself and everyone around you. That's pretty much the definition of selfish. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. You want to know what I'd call it? I'd call it the first time in my adult life that I've had control over my own space, my own schedule, and my own decisions. I'd call it finally being able to invite someone over without having to introduce them to my entire family. I'd call it being able to work on my art projects at 2 in the morning, without being told I'm keeping everyone awake. Art projects, Derek scoffed. You mean those weird digital paintings that nobody buys? The comment hit exactly where it was meant to. My freelance graphic design work paid the bills, but my real passion was digital art. Surreal landscapes and abstract pieces that I posted on various online galleries. I'd sold exactly 3 pieces in the past year, which my family never let me forget. Those weird digital paintings are part of who I am, I said quietly. They're something I create, something that comes from me, not from family expectations or practical considerations. But I guess pursuing something you love is selfish too. Robert sighed heavily. Madison, nobody's saying you shouldn't do your art. We're saying you need to be realistic about supporting yourself. And right now you're choosing to struggle instead of accepting help, which affects all of us because we worry about you. So let me get this straight, I said, looking around the table at their faces. I'm selfish for living independently, selfish for pursuing my art, selfish for not wanting to move back home, and selfish for not letting you worry about me. Is there anything I could do that wouldn't be selfish in your opinion? Caroline set down her water glass with a sharp clink. You could stop being so dramatic about everything. You could recognize that family comes first, and that sometimes being part of a family means making compromise. I've been making compromises my entire life, I said, feeling 28 years of frustration bubbling up. I compromised when I majored in business instead of fine arts because it was more practical. I compromised when I took the graphic design job instead of trying to freelance full-time with my art because it was more stable. I compromised when I stayed in Cedar Falls instead of moving to Chicago or New York where there are actually opportunities for artists because I wanted to be close to family. And look how well those compromises worked out, Patricia said with that infuriating patient smile. You have a steady job, you're close to family, you're building a foundation for your future. No, I said, shaking my head. I have a job that pays just enough to survive, I'm close to a family that thinks my dreams are weird hobbies, and I'm building a foundation for someone else's idea of what my future should look like. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the dishwasher humming in the kitchen, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Finally, Robert spoke. Madison, I think you need to take some time to think about your priorities. We love you, but we're not going to enable this phase you're going through. Phase? I laughed, but it came out bitter. Dad, I'm 28 years old. This isn't a phase. This is who I am. Who you are, Caroline said slowly, is someone who's so focused on being different that you're making terrible financial decisions and refusing help from people who love you. If that's not selfish, I don't know what is. There it was again, that word, selfish. I looked around the table at my family, my parents who had worked hard to provide for us, who had sacrificed to send us to college, who genuinely believed they were helping me. My siblings who had followed more traditional paths and couldn't understand why I was fighting so hard for something they saw as pointless. They weren't evil people. They weren't trying to hurt me, but they were trying to force me into a mold that didn't fit, and when I resisted, I became the selfish one. You know what? I said, grabbing my purse from the back of my chair. You're right. I am selfish. I'm selfish enough to want my own space. I'm selfish enough to pursue my art even when it doesn't make money. I'm selfish enough to want to make my own mistakes, instead of living someone else's idea of a safe, practical life. Madison, don't be ridiculous, Patricia said, standing up as well. Sit back down and let's talk about this like adults. We've been talking about this for months, I said, heading toward the dining room doorway. And every conversation ends the same way, with me being told I'm selfish for wanting something different than what you want for me. So what are you going to do? Derek called after me. Storm out dramatically and prove our point. I stopped in the doorway and turned back to look at them. I'm going to go home to my tiny, overpriced apartment, where I can eat ramen noodles in peace without being lectured about my life choices. And I'm going to work on my weird art projects that nobody buys, because apparently, that's what selfish people do. Madison! Robert's voice had taken on that warning tone he used to use when I was a teenager. Don't leave like this. We're family. Yeah, I said, looking at each of their faces one more time. We are family. And according to all of you, I'm the selfish one for wanting to define what that means for myself instead of just accepting your definition. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I walked out of that dining room, out of that house, and into the cool November evening air. As I sat in my temperamental Honda Civic waiting for it to start, I could see them through the dining room window, probably already discussing how dramatic and unreasonable I was being. The car finally turned over on the fourth try, and I drove back to my cramped apartment where the heat was, indeed, unreliable, and the walls were thin enough that I could hear my upstairs neighbor's television. I climbed the 2 flights of stairs to my door, let myself into my small but private space and sat on my second-hand couch in the dark. Maybe they were right, maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should be grateful for their concern, and accept their help and move back home where I could save money, and help with household projects and listen to weekly lectures about my poor life choices. Or maybe, just maybe, being selfish wasn't always a bad thing. I had no idea that within 3 weeks I would discover just how selfish I could actually be when given the opportunity. And it would all start with a phone call that would change everything. But that night, sitting in my tiny apartment, eating leftover Chinese takeout and working on a digital painting of a woman trapped in a house made of mirrors, I just felt tired. Tired of defending my choices. Tired of being made to feel guilty for wanting independence. Tired of having the same fight over and over again. The painting on my computer screen stared back at me, the woman in the mirror house, surrounded by distorted reflections of herself, each one showing a different version of who she could be if she just stopped being so selfish and accepted what everyone else thought she should be. I saved the file and closed my laptop. Tomorrow was Monday, which meant another week of designing corporate brochures and trying to make other people's visions come to life, while my own artistic dreams got pushed further and further into the background. But at least it was my choice to make that compromise. At least in this tiny, overpriced apartment with unreliable heat, I was making my own decisions, even if they were supposedly selfish ones. Little did I know that my family's definition of selfish was about to be put to the ultimate test. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was hunched over my computer, trying to make a veterinary clinic's logo look more approachable but still professional, whatever that meant. My phone buzzed against my desk, showing Mom's contact photo, a smiling woman in a flower garden who bore little resemblance to the disappointed figure from Sunday's dinner. Madison, honey, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you say no. I minimized the logo design and leaned back in my desk chair, already preparing for another lecture disguised as a request. What is it, Mom? You know how your father and I have been talking about getting that property management company to handle the lake house? The lake house. Even thinking about it made something twist in my chest. 3 years ago, my parents had surprised everyone by purchasing a vacation home on Crystal Lake, about 2 hours north of Cedar Falls. It was their dream retirement project. A sprawling cedar and stone house with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the water, a private dock and enough space for the whole extended family to gather for holidays and summer weekends. The problem was, they bought it right before Dad's construction company hit a rough patch. What was supposed to be their relaxing getaway had become a source of stress and financial strain. They couldn't afford to furnish it properly, couldn't use it as often as they'd planned, and couldn't bring themselves to sell what they called their forever home. What about the property management company? I asked, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. Well, they want 15% of any rental income, plus fees for maintenance and cleaning. And honestly, Madison, we're not sure we trust strangers to take care of the place properly. Your father spent 3 years getting every detail perfect. I waited. There was always more with Mom. So, we were thinking, what if someone from the family stayed there? Just temporarily. You understand. To keep an eye on things. Maybe do some minor upkeep. Make sure everything stays in good condition. My grip tightened on the phone. Mom, if you're about to ask me to move back home so someone can babysit your vacation house. No, that's not what I'm saying, at all. Her voice took on that careful, measured tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable. I'm saying, what if you moved to the lake house? Temporarily, just for a few months while we figure out our long-term plan. I blinked at my computer screen, certain I'd misheard. You want me to move to the lake house? Think about it, Madison. You're struggling to make ends meet in that tiny apartment. The lake house is just sitting empty most of the time, costing us money in utilities and maintenance. You could live there, rent-free in exchange for basic upkeep and keeping an eye on things. Rent-free. The words echoed in my head like a bell. I was currently paying $850 a month for my one-bedroom apartment, which was nearly half my take-home pay. Living rent-free would mean I could actually save money. Maybe even build up an emergency fund, possibly reduce my graphic design hours and focus more on my art. But there had to be a catch. What's the real reason you're offering this? I asked suspiciously. Last Sunday you were telling me I was selfish for wanting to live alone, and now you want me to live alone in your dream house. Patricia's sigh carried clearly through the phone. Madison, your father and I have been talking, and maybe we were a little harsh on Sunday. We just worry about you, honey. But Caroline pointed out that maybe we were approaching this wrong. Caroline? Of course. What did Caroline say? She said that maybe the problem isn't that you want to live alone. Maybe the problem is that you're living alone in a place where you're barely surviving, instead of thriving. She said maybe if you had some financial breathing room, you'd be able to make better long-term decisions. I could practically hear Caroline's voice in those words. My sister had a talent for packaging control as helpfulness, making her ideas sound like she was doing you a favor. And what does Dad think about this? He's the one who suggested it. Actually, he said the house needs someone there regularly anyway. The furnace needs to be checked. The pipes need to be run periodically so they don't freeze. The driveway needs to be plowed. He was going to hire a caretaker, but then we realized you could handle all of that. A caretaker. That's what I would be. A live-in caretaker for my parents' vacation home. The irony wasn't lost on me. What about when you want to use the house? We'd give you plenty of notice. Of course, probably just holidays and maybe a few summer weekends. Most of the time it would be all yours. I stared out my apartment window at the brick wall of the building next door, then closed my eyes and tried to picture the lake house. I'd only been there a handful of times, a few awkward family gatherings where everyone pretended we weren't all thinking about how much money it was costing. But I remembered the massive stone fireplace, the kitchen with its granite counters and professional-grade appliances, the master bedroom with French doors that opened onto a balcony overlooking the water. More importantly, I remembered the basement room that Dad had initially planned as a home office. It had perfect natural light from high windows and enough space for a proper art studio, something I'd only dreamed about in my cramped apartment, where my easel had to compete with my dining table for floor space. I'd have complete privacy, I asked. No unexpected visits, no lectures about my lifestyle choices, no family meetings about my future. Madison, we're offering you a beautiful home, rent-free. All we're asking is that you take care of it. That wasn't an answer to my question, but it was probably the best I was going to get. How long are we talking about? Initially, maybe 6 months? Just to see how it works out for everyone. 6 months. 6 months of not paying rent, not listening to my upstairs neighbor's television, not having to explain my comings and goings to anyone. 6 months to build up some savings, to work on my art without worrying about disturbing anyone, to finally have space to spread out and create. What about the commute to my office? It's only 2 hours. Lots of people commute that distance. And didn't you say your boss was open to more remote work arrangements? I had mentioned that, back when I was still trying to convince them that my job was stable and legitimate. My boss, Janet, had indeed suggested that I could work from home 2 or 3 days a week if I wanted to. I'd never taken her up on it, because working from my tiny apartment felt too cramped and distracting. But working from a spacious house overlooking a lake, that was a different story entirely. I need to think about it, I said finally. Of course, honey. But don't think too long. Winter's coming, and if we're going to do this, we should probably get you moved in before the weather gets too bad. After I hung up, I sat in my desk chair for a long time, staring at the veterinary logo on my screen, without really seeing it. A part of me, a large part, was immediately suspicious of this sudden generosity. My family didn't just hand out favors without expecting something in return. But another part of me was already imagining what it would be like to wake up to a view of the lake instead of a brick wall. To have space to paint, to create, to spread out my art supplies without having to pack them away every time I needed to eat dinner, to live somewhere beautiful instead of just functional. I picked up my phone and called my best friend Jessica, who worked as a teacher in the next town over. They offered you what? Jessica's voice was incredulous. Madison, that house is gorgeous. I saw the pictures on your mom's Facebook. It's like something out of a magazine. I know, but you don't understand my family. They don't just do nice things without expecting something in return. There's gotta be a catch. Maybe the catch is that they realized you were right about needing independence, and they're trying to give you a compromise that works for everyone. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the alley behind my building, where someone had left a broken washing machine next to the dumpster. Or maybe they think that if they give me something nice, I'll be more grateful and compliant. Maybe this is just another way of controlling my life. Madison. Jessica's voice was gentle but firm. I love you, but sometimes I think you're so used to fighting with your family that you can't recognize when they're actually trying to help you. Help me. Or help themselves by getting free property management. Does it matter? You get a beautiful place to live rent-free. They get someone trustworthy taking care of their investment. Everybody wins. That afternoon, I drove out to Crystal Lake. I told myself I was just going to look at the house from the outside, maybe walk around the property a bit, get a feel for what it would actually be like to live there. The drive took me through rolling farmland and small towns I'd never really paid attention to before. As I got closer to the lake, the landscape became more wooded, more secluded. The houses grew larger and farther apart. Many of them tucked back into the trees with long, winding driveways. My parents' house sat on a slight rise overlooking the water, with a circular driveway and landscaping that must have cost more than I made in 6 months. Even from the outside, it was impressive. All cedar and stone and glass, designed to look rustic but clearly expensive. I used the spare key that was hidden under a fake rock near the front door, a family secret that somehow made me feel like I was doing something illicit. The inside was exactly as I remembered, but somehow more overwhelming when I was alone. The great room had soaring ceilings and that massive stone fireplace, with built-in bookshelves that were mostly empty because my parents hadn't had time to properly furnish the place. The kitchen was a chef's dream. All stainless steel and granite and space. So much space. But it was the basement that really got to me. Dad had finished it as a family room and office space, with thick carpet and wood paneling and those high windows that let in perfect natural light. Standing in that room, could suddenly see it clearly. My easel by the windows, my art supplies organized in the built-in cabinets, canvases propped against the walls, a proper workspace where I could create without constraints. I walked through the entire house slowly, imagining what it would be like to call this place home, even temporarily. The master bedroom with its king-size bed and private balcony. The guest rooms that could serve as storage for my art supplies. The dining room where I could spread out my design projects without having to clear them away for meals. It was everything my cramped apartment wasn't: spacious, beautiful, private, peaceful. As I stood on the deck overlooking the lake, watching the afternoon sun sparkle on the water, I realized something that made my chest tighten with a mixture of excitement and guilt. I wanted this. I wanted it badly. Not just the space or the savings or the artistic possibilities. I wanted the luxury of it, the beauty of it, the way it would feel to live somewhere that looked like success instead of struggle. I wanted to wake up to water views instead of brick walls. I wanted to have dinner parties in a kitchen that could actually accommodate more than 2 people. I wanted to feel for once in my adult life like I was living well instead of just getting by. And that wanting felt dangerous because it was exactly the kind of wanting that my family would call selfish. I locked up the house and drove back to Cedar Falls as the sun set behind me, my mind racing with possibilities and concerns in equal measure. By the time I pulled into the parking lot behind my apartment building, I had made my decision. I was going to take them up on their offer. I was going to live in their dream house, save money on rent, and use the opportunity to finally give my art the time and space it deserved. What I didn't realize, as I climbed those 2 flights of stairs to my tiny apartment one more time, was that accepting this offer would set in motion a chain of events that would test every assumption my family had about my character. They thought they knew who I was, the selfish daughter who chose struggle over compromise. They thought they were giving me a chance to prove them wrong, to show that I could be grateful and responsible and properly appreciative of their generosity. What they didn't count on was that living in luxury might teach me just how selfish I could actually be when given the chance. The phone call to accept their offer could wait until morning. Tonight, I had plans and dreams to chase. The moving truck looked ridiculously small in the circular driveway of the lake house. Everything I owned, furniture, clothes, art supplies, and a lifetime of accumulated belongings, fit into a space that could have been easily swallowed by the house's 3-car garage. As I watched the movers carry my second-hand couch through the front door, I felt like I was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Derek had shown up to help, though help mostly involved him wandering through the house, making comments about how much everything must have cost while I directed the placement of my meager possessions. He picked up one of my framed digital art prints, an abstract landscape in blues and purples that I'd had printed at the local copy shop, and studied it with the expression of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "You know, Maddie, this would actually look decent in a house like this," he said, holding it up against the stone wall in the great room. "It's got that expensive art vibe, even though it's not, actual expensive art." I wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or an insult, so I chose to ignore it entirely. "Can you help me figure out where to put my desk? I'm thinking the basement would be perfect for a home office and art studio." "Smart choice. Dad always said that room had the best light in the house." Derek followed me downstairs, where the movers had already placed my small desk against one wall. In my apartment, that desk had dominated the living space. Here, it looked lost. "This is surreal," I admitted, looking around at the spacious basement with its thick carpeting and built-in shelving. 3 days ago I was worried about paying my electric bill, and now I'm living in a house that probably costs more per month in property taxes than I was paying in rent. "Yeah, about that," Derek said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "Mom wanted me to go over a few things with you. Ground rules, I guess." My stomach clenched. Here it came, the catch I'd been waiting for. "She made a list," Derek continued, pulling out his phone. "First, utilities are covered, but try to be reasonable. Don't heat the whole house to 75 degrees or leave lights on in rooms you're not using." That seemed fair enough. I nodded. "Second, any maintenance issues that cost more than $50 need to be approved first. Call Dad before you hire anyone or buy anything for the house." Also reasonable, though it stung a little to be reminded that this wasn't actually my house. "Third, family visits get priority. If Mom and Dad want to use the house for a weekend, you'll need to either make yourself scarce or be prepared to share the space graciously." "Define graciously," I said, crossing my arms. Derek shrugged. I think it means don't act like they're invading your space when it's their space they're letting you use. The message was clear. I was a guest here, not a resident. No matter how long I stayed or how much I contributed to maintaining the place, I needed to remember my position in the hierarchy. Anything else? Just that they're really hoping this works out, Derek said, his voice softening. I know you guys have been butting heads lately, but they're trying, Maddie. They really are. After Derek left, I spent the rest of the day arranging my belongings in the cavernous house. My clothes barely filled one dresser in the master bedroom. My books took up less than a quarter of one built-in bookshelf. My art supplies, which had cluttered my entire apartment, fit neatly into a single basement cabinet with room to spare. That first night, I ordered pizza and ate it at the massive dining room table, feeling like a child playing house. The silence was profound in a way that city silence never was. No traffic, no neighbors, no ambient urban noise, just the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the occasional call of nightbirds. I called Jessica to report on the move. How does it feel? She asked. Are you loving it? It's beautiful, I said, walking to the deck doors to look out at the moonlight on the water. Almost too beautiful. I keep feeling like someone's gonna come tell me there's been a mistake, and I need to leave. Maybe that's just because you're not used to nice things. Maybe it's time you got used to them. That comment stuck with me as I lay in the king-size bed that night, staring up at ceiling that was easily twice as high as my apartment ceiling had been. Maybe Jessica was right. Maybe I wasn't used to nice things, because I'd convinced myself I didn't deserve them. Or because I'd been so focused on proving my independence that I'd forgotten there was a difference between independence and unnecessary struggle. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and the sight of mist rising off the lake. I made coffee in the professional-grade kitchen and took it out to the deck, where I sat for an hour watching the world wake up around me. For the first time in months, I felt something I barely recognized: contentment. I set up my home office in the basement, arranging my art supplies with a precision born of sudden abundance of space. I had room for multiple easels, storage for canvases, a dedicated area for digital work, and even space left over for future projects. The natural light was everything I'd imagined, soft and even, perfect for color work. My first official day of remote work from the lake house was a revelation. Instead of hunching over my laptop at my tiny kitchen table, I spread out my design projects across the dining room table. I took breaks to walk on the deck, to make proper meals in the full kitchen, to work on my personal art in natural light that made everything look better. The veterinary clinic logo that had been giving me trouble suddenly came together when I had space to print out multiple versions and compare them side by side. A website design for a local restaurant flowed more smoothly when I could step away from the screen and sketch ideas on paper without having to clear space first. But it was the evenings that really transformed my routine. Instead of collapsing in front of Netflix in my cramped living room, I found myself drawn to the art studio I'd created. I started a new digital painting series, Lake Scenes, but abstract, capturing the feeling of water and light and space rather than literal representations. The first painting surprised me with its confidence, its boldness of color and composition. The second was even better. By the end of my first week, I had completed 3 pieces that felt more accomplished than anything I'd done in the past year. I posted them on my online gallery almost as an afterthought, not expecting much response. Digital art was a tough market, and my previous sales had been few and far between. The first inquiry came 2 days later, a collector from Minneapolis who wanted to know if I had prints available. Then another, from someone in Chicago who was interested in commissioning a custom piece. Within a week, I had sold 2 of the 3 paintings and received 3 commission requests. The difference in my work was undeniable, and I knew it wasn't just about having better light or more space. It was about feeling, for the first time, like I was living the life of a real artist instead of someone who did art as a hobby between survival jobs. I called my parents to update them on how things were going. "The house is perfect," I told Mom, standing on the deck with my afternoon coffee. "Thank you again for letting me stay here." It's already making such a difference in my work. Oh, that's wonderful. Honey, your father will be so pleased to hear that. He's been worried about the furnace. Has it been running properly? Everything's working perfectly. I checked the basement daily like Dad asked. And I've been running the faucets and managing the thermostat just like he showed me. Good, good. And you're keeping the place clean? I know it's a lot of space for one person. Mom, it's immaculate. I'm probably taking better care of it than you and Dad do when you're here. There was a pause, and I realized how that might have sounded. I just mean I have more time to focus on maintenance since it's my full-time residence, I clarified quickly. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take care of such a beautiful place. Of course you are, honey. Listen, your father and I were thinking of coming up this weekend to check on a few things, and maybe take advantage of the fall colors. Would that work for you? My stomach dropped slightly. It had been less than 2 weeks, and I was already being reminded that this wasn't actually my home. Of course, I said. Should I plan to stay elsewhere? Oh, no need for that. The house is plenty big enough for all of us. Besides, it'll be nice to spend some time together without all the Sunday dinner drama. That weekend was my first real test of the gracious sharing expectation. Mom and Dad arrived Friday afternoon with enough groceries to feed a small army and immediately began rearranging things to suit their preferences. Dad turned the thermostat up 3 degrees, declaring the house too chilly. Mom moved my coffee maker to a different counter because she preferred the workspace flow the other way. They weren't trying to be difficult, but their casual assumption that they could modify my living space, even temporarily, reminded me exactly whose name was on the deed. The weekend itself was surprisingly pleasant. We cooked together in the spacious kitchen, sat by the fire talking about family memories, and took a boat ride to see the autumn foliage. For the first time in months, I felt like we were relating to each other as adults rather than parents and wayward children. But I also noticed how differently they treated me in this setting. Here, surrounded by their investment, their dream home, their carefully chosen furnishings, I wasn't the struggling artist making poor life choices. I was the responsible daughter taking care of the family property. You know, Dad said Saturday evening, as we sat on the deck watching the sunset. I was skeptical about this arrangement at first, but seeing how you've settled in here, how you're taking care of everything, I think this might be exactly what you needed. What do you mean? I mean living somewhere that reflects your potential instead of your limitations. This house suits you, Madison. You look like you belong in a place like this. I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Was he saying I looked like I belonged in luxury, or that I looked like I belonged in a place that wasn't actually mine? The art studio is incredible, Mom added. I can see why your work has been improving so much. Sometimes a person just needs the right environment to flourish. That night, after they'd gone to bed in the guest room, I sat in my makeshift studio, looking at the paintings I'd completed over the past 2 weeks. They were good, better than good. They had a confidence and sophistication that my apartment work had lacked. But was that because of the better light and space, or because of something else? Was I creating better art because I finally had proper resources, or because I finally felt like I was living a life worthy of good art? The question unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Sunday morning, as my parents packed up to leave, Mom handed me an envelope. What's this? Just a little something to help with groceries and incidentals. We know you're saving money on rent, but we want to make sure you're comfortable. Inside was $200 in cash. Mom, you don't need to. Nonsense, you're doing us a favor by staying here. It's the least we can do. After they left, I sat at the dining room table, staring at the money. It was a generous gesture, one that would definitely help with my budget, but it also felt like something more, like a payment, maybe, or a reminder of the transaction underlying our arrangement. I was living in their dream house, rent-free, eating meals in their gourmet kitchen, creating art in their perfectly lit studio space. And now they were giving me money on top of it. For the first time since moving in, I wondered if I was becoming exactly the kind of person I'd always criticized. Someone whose lifestyle was subsidized by family money, someone who lived above their actual means because of someone else's generosity. But as I looked around at the beautiful space, at the art I'd created, at the life I was building, I realized something that should have troubled me more than it did. I didn't care. I was living better than I ever had, creating better art than I ever had, and feeling more like the person I wanted to be than I ever had. If that made me selfish, if that made me dependent on family generosity, if that made me exactly the kind of person I'd once judged, well, maybe those were prices I was willing to pay. After all, my family had called me selfish for wanting independence. Maybe it was time to show them what selfish actually looked like when it came with privilege, instead of struggle. 3 months into my lake house residency, I was living a life I barely recognized. My online art sales had increased by 400%. I had a waiting list for commissioned pieces, and I'd been featured in 2 digital art blogs. More importantly, I was no longer just getting by. I was actually building savings for the first time in my adult life. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It started with small changes in my daily routine. Luxuries I'd never been able to afford before. Real coffee beans instead of instant. Fresh ingredients for elaborate meals I could cook in a kitchen with actual counter space. Art supplies I'd been coveting for years but couldn't justify purchasing. I'd also made friends in town, something that had been nearly impossible when I was working 60-hour weeks just to make rent. Crystal Lake had a small but thriving artistic community, and once word got out that someone was actually living in the Whitmore Lake House, invitations started arriving. That's how I met Trevor Nash, the owner of Lakeside Gallery, a high-end art space that catered to the summer crowd of wealthy vacation homeowners. We met at a coffee shop in the town center, where I'd gone to work for a change of scenery. He'd noticed my laptop screen, which displayed one of my latest lake paintings. "Excuse me," he'd said, approaching my table with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "I couldn't help but notice your work. Are you local?" Trevor was probably 45, with silver-touched hair and the kind of casual clothes that cost more than most people's formal wear. He had the air of someone who'd made enough money in a previous career to pursue his passion for art without worrying about profit margins. "I'm staying here temporarily," I said, which had become my standard response to avoid complicated explanations about family dynamics and property arrangements. "That's stunning work," he said, studying my screen more closely. "Very sophisticated use of color and light. Have you seen it anywhere locally?" That conversation led to coffee the next day, which led to him visiting my studio, which led to the most surreal moment of my artistic career, Trevor offering me a solo show at his gallery. "I've been looking for someone who captures the essence of lake country without falling into tourist trap cliches," he explained, standing in my basement studio, surrounded by canvases. "Your work has this emotional complexity that's rare in landscape painting, even abstract landscape painting." The show was scheduled for December, just before the holiday season when wealthy families would be decorating their vacation homes and looking for local art to purchase as gifts. Trevor estimated that we could price my pieces between $800 and $1,500 each, numbers that made my head spin. "Are you sure?" I asked, still not quite believing this was happening. "I mean, 6 months ago I was selling prints for $50 each. Madison, you're not the same artist you were 6 months ago. Environment matters. Resources matter. Confidence matters. You're creating work that belongs in a serious gallery now." That evening, I called Jessica to share the news. "Madison, this is incredible," she squealed. "A solo show. Do you know how big this is?" "I'm trying not to think about it too much or I'll panic," I admitted, pacing around the great room with my phone. What if nobody comes? What if nobody buys anything? What if Trevor realizes he made a mistake? "Stop it. You're amazing. Your work is amazing. And this is happening because you finally have the space and resources to be the artist you were meant to be." Later that night, I video called my parents to share the news. They were in their Millbrook living room, huddled together in front of Dad's laptop screen. "A gallery show?" Mom's voice was excited but slightly bewildered. "Honey, that's wonderful. But how much are these paintings supposed to sell for?" When I told them the projected price range, The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. $800 to $1,500, Dad finally said. For one painting. Trevor thinks they could go even higher if there's a bidding situation, I said, immediately regretting adding that detail when I saw their expressions. Madison, Mom said carefully. That's wonderful. Of course, but don't you think you should be realistic about expectations? I mean, 6 months ago, you were struggling to pay your rent. There it was again, the reminder of my previous circumstances. The suggestion that my current success was somehow temporary or undeserved. Mom, my art has genuinely improved. I'm creating work that's getting serious attention from collectors and critics. This isn't just luck or wishful thinking. Of course it's improved, Dad said. You have proper space, good light, no financial stress. Anyone would do better work under those conditions. Something in his tone bothered me. Are you saying my success isn't really mine? No, sweetheart, Mom interjected quickly. We're just saying that circumstances matter. The house has given you opportunities you wouldn't have had otherwise. They weren't wrong, but the way they said it made my accomplishments feel diminished. Like I was a child playing dress-up rather than an artist who'd worked hard to develop her craft. After we hung up, I wandered through the house feeling unsettled. My parents' reaction had been supportive but cautious, as if they were waiting for reality to catch up with my newfound success. They seemed to view my gallery show as a nice hobby development rather than a potential career breakthrough. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Trevor helped me select pieces for the show, arrange for professional photography, and write artist statements that struck the right balance of accessible and sophisticated. I found myself learning the business side of art in ways I'd never had to before: pricing strategies, collector psychology, the importance of creating a narrative around your work. I also found myself spending money differently. Not recklessly, but with a confidence I'd never had before. I bought professional quality art supplies without agonizing over the cost. I had my hair done at an expensive salon, because Trevor mentioned that opening night was as much about presentation as artwork. I bought clothes that looked like what a successful artist would wear. Flowing scarves, statement jewelry, boots that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month. Caroline noticed the change when she visited in mid-November. Madison, you look, she paused, studying me as I made lunch in the gourmet kitchen. Different. More polished, I guess. I feel different, I admitted, arranging a salad that included ingredients I'd never bothered with when I was counting every dollar: goat cheese, candied walnuts, artisanal vinaigrette. Living here has changed how I see myself, how I see my work. The house suits you, Caroline said, but there was something in her voice I couldn't quite identify. You've really made yourself at home. We ate lunch on the deck, despite the November chill, wrapped in blankets and drinking wine that Trevor had recommended for its notes of oak and cherry, the kind of wine description I would have rolled my eyes at 6 months earlier, but now found myself using unironically. So tell me about this gallery show, Caroline said. Mom and Dad seem excited but nervous. Nervous about what? I think they're worried about what happens if it doesn't go well. Or maybe what happens if it goes too well. What do you mean? Caroline swirled her wine thoughtfully. Madison, you've been living here rent-free for 3 months. You've essentially had a free ride to pursue your art without any of the financial pressures normal people deal with. What happens when this arrangement ends and you have to go back to real life? This is real life, I said, hearing the defensiveness in my own voice. I'm working, I'm creating, I'm building a career. Just because it's not the traditional struggle and starve artist path doesn't make it less real. But it's not sustainable, is it? I mean, eventually Mom and Dad are going to want to use this house more, or sell it, or rent it out properly. You can't live here forever. I hadn't thought much about the long-term sustainability of my arrangement, mainly because I'd been too busy enjoying the immediate benefits. But Caroline's questions forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. My current lifestyle was entirely dependent on my family's continued generosity. Maybe by then I'll be successful enough to afford my own place like this, I said. Caroline raised an eyebrow. Madison, Do you know what houses like this cost? Even if your gallery show is wildly successful, you're talking about needing to sell dozens of paintings at top prices just to afford 1 year's worth of property taxes on a place like this. That night, after Caroline left, I sat in my studio looking at the paintings I'd created over the past few months. They were good, undeniably good. But how much of their quality came from my improved skill, and how much came from the luxury of having perfect conditions to work in? More troubling was a question I hadn't allowed myself to consider. Who was I becoming in this house? 6 months ago, I'd been proud of my independence. Even if it meant struggle, I'd defined myself in opposition to my family's materialism, their focus on comfort and status over authenticity and artistic integrity. Now I found myself caring about thread counts and wine varieties. I chose restaurants based on ambiance rather than affordability. I'd started unconsciously mimicking the speech patterns of the wealthy art collectors I'd been meeting through Trevor. Was this personal growth? Or was I becoming someone I used to judge? My phone buzzed with a text from Trevor. Gallery looks perfect. Opening night is going to be magical. Are you ready to change your life? I looked around at my beautiful studio, at the canvases that would soon hang in a prestigious gallery with price tags that still felt surreal, at the life I'd built in this borrowed paradise. Ready to change my life? I was already living a completely different life than I'd had 6 months ago. The question was whether I was changing for the better, or just becoming more comfortable with being someone I'd once considered shallow. But as I prepared for bed in the master suite with its Egyptian cotton sheets and lake views, I realized something that should have concerned me more than it did. I didn't really care about the philosophical implications anymore. I liked this life. I liked the comfort, the space, the freedom from financial anxiety. I liked being taken seriously as an artist, being courted by gallery owners, being able to afford quality materials and professional services. If that made me materialistic or privileged or hypocritical, so be it. My family had called me selfish for wanting independence when I was struggling. What were they going to call me now that I was succeeding? I was about to find out. Because the gallery opening was just 2 weeks away, and my entire family had promised to attend. They would see exactly what their selfish daughter had accomplished with the opportunities they'd given her. They might not like what they discovered about who I'd become in the process. The week before my gallery opening, everything started falling apart. It began with a phone call from Mom on Tuesday morning. I was in my studio, putting finishing touches on the last piece for the show, a particularly complex abstract that captured the way morning mist moved across the lake, when her name appeared on my phone screen. Madison, honey, we need to talk about Christmas. I paused mid-brushstroke. What about Christmas? Well, your Aunt Helen and Uncle Jim are flying in from Phoenix, and the Hendersons want to do our traditional Christmas Eve gathering again this year. We were planning to have everyone at the lake house. My stomach dropped. Christmas was still 3 weeks away, but Patricia's tone suggested this wasn't a request for my input so much as a notification of decisions already made. The entire family? How many people are we talking about? Oh, not too many. Helen and Jim, the Hendersons, that's Mark and Susan, and their 3 kids, plus Caroline and Derek, and your father's brother Paul with his new girlfriend. Maybe 15 people total, just for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. 15 people in the house where I'd been living alone for 4 months. 15 people who would expect me to play hostess in a space I was finally starting to think of as home. Mom, my gallery opening is this Friday. I'll probably have collectors and potential buyers wanting to visit my studio over the weekend. This is a crucial time for my career. Oh, sweetie, I'm sure you can work around that. Besides, it'll be nice for the family to see your art space. Uncle Jim has always been interested in painting. Maybe he'll want to buy something. The idea of Uncle Jim, who thought artistic sophistication meant having a velvet Elvis in his den, browsing through my gallery-bound paintings made me wince. I need space to work, I said, trying to keep my voice level. And to host potential clients. Could we maybe do Christmas at the Millbrook house this year? The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Madison. Patricia's voice had taken on that patient, disappointed tone. I remembered from my teenage years. This was your father's idea. He wants to show off the house. And frankly, we think it's time you learn to share the space graciously. You've had it to yourself for months. There it was again. That reminder that this wasn't actually my home, no matter how much it had started to feel like one. Of course I can share, I said, though even as I said it, I was mentally calculating how I could possibly prepare for my most important professional moment while playing host to my extended family. I just need to know the dates so I can plan accordingly. December 23rd through December 26th. And Madison, your father wants the master bedroom for Helen and Jim. They're older, and Helen has that bad hip. You'll need to move into one of the guest rooms. After hanging up, I stood in my studio for a long time, looking at the paintings that would hang in Trevor's gallery in just 4 days. Each piece represented dozens of hours of work, moments of inspiration and breakthrough, the gradual development of an artistic voice I was finally proud of. The thought of family members tramping through this space, commenting on my hobby, asking if I'd painted the pretty lake pictures. It made my chest tight with protective anxiety. I called Trevor to warn him about the potential complications. 15 family members during opening weekend. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the concern underneath. Madison, you understand that the first week after a show opening is crucial for building momentum. Collectors want to visit artist studios, see work in progress, and establish relationships. I know. I'm trying to figure out how to manage both. Listen, I don't want to overstep, but would it be possible for you to stay somewhere else during their visit? Maybe rent a hotel room in town. I could even help with the cost if needed. The suggestion that I should leave my home for my family's convenience hit me like a slap. But as I looked around the studio that had become the center of my creative life, I realized Trevor was right. I couldn't possibly host my first serious art opening while also playing gracious hostess to a house full of relatives who thought my art career was a cute phase. Let me think about it, I said. That afternoon, I drove into town to clear my head, ended up at the coffee shop where I'd first met Trevor. I was staring into my latte when a familiar voice interrupted my brooding. Madison? Madison Whitmore? I looked up to see Bryce Peterson, someone I'd gone to high school with who now worked as a real estate agent in Crystal Lake. He was wearing an expensive suit and the kind of confident smile that suggested life had treated him well. Bryce. Hi. What are you doing here? I work here now. Moved up from Cedar Falls about 2 years ago when the market got hot. I heard through the grapevine that you're the artist everyone's talking about. Gallery opening this weekend, right? Word traveled fast in a small town. That's right. Trevor Nash is representing me. Trevor's got great taste and great connections. Bryce slid into the seat across from me without being invited. Actually, I'm glad I ran into you. I've been meaning to reach out. About what? Your living situation. I know you're staying at your parents' place, but I've got some clients who are very interested in that property. Off-market interest, if you know what I mean. I blinked at him. What are you talking about? The lake house. There's a tech executive from Minneapolis who's been looking for exactly that kind of property. He's willing to pay significantly above market value for the right place, and your parents' house fits his specifications perfectly. The world seemed to tilt slightly. My parents haven't said anything about selling. Well, they wouldn't necessarily discuss it publicly until they were ready to move forward. But I know for a fact that your dad's been asking questions about current market values. That usually means someone's at least considering their options. Bryce leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Look, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but the offer I'm prepared to make would be life-changing money for your family. We're talking about enough to pay off their mortgage in Millbrook, fund both their retirements, and still have a substantial nest egg left over. I felt like I was drowning. How much money? I can't give you exact numbers without a formal appraisal, but based on comparable sales and this buyer's budget, probably somewhere north of $800,000. Maybe closer to $1 million if the inspection goes well. $1 million. My parents had paid $450,000 for the house 3 years ago. In the current market, with the right buyer, they could more than double their investment. Have you talked to them about this? Not directly. I wanted to feel out the situation first, see if there was any family resistance to the idea. He studied my face carefully. You've gotten pretty comfortable there, haven't you? I couldn't deny it. The lake house had become more than just a temporary living situation. It had become my home, my studio, my sanctuary. The thought of losing it, especially right as my art career was taking off, felt like losing everything I'd worked toward. When would this hypothetical sale happen? If your parents were interested, I'd want to move quickly. This buyer is looking to close before the end of the year for tax purposes. We'd probably need to have papers signed by mid-January at the latest. Mid-January. 6 weeks away. I drove home in a daze, Bryce's words echoing in my head. When I pulled into the circular driveway, I saw the house differently, not as my sanctuary but as a valuable asset that belonged to someone else, someone who might very well decide that life-changing money was worth more than their daughter's artistic breakthrough. That evening, I called Derek. Did you know Mom and Dad are thinking about selling the lake house? What? No. Where did you hear that? I told him about my conversation with Bryce Peterson. Madison, you're being paranoid. Mom and Dad love that house. It's their dream retirement home. But they're also practical people who understand that $800,000 could solve a lot of problems. Even if they were considering it, which I doubt, they wouldn't just kick you out without warning. You're doing them a favor by staying there. But as I hung up, I realized that Derek's reassurance didn't address the fundamental issue. The house wasn't mine. No matter how much I'd invested emotionally in the space, no matter how much my art had improved because of it, no matter how much it felt like home, I had no actual claim to it. I was completely dependent on my family's continued generosity, and that generosity could be withdrawn at any time. The gallery opening was now 3 days away, and instead of feeling excited and confident, I felt sick with anxiety. Everything I'd built over the past 4 months suddenly felt fragile, temporary, borrowed. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, perfect weather for an art opening. I spent the day at the gallery with Trevor, making final adjustments to the lighting and placement. My paintings looked stunning in the professional space, sophisticated, confident, worthy of their price tags. You should be proud, Trevor said as we stepped back to admire the completed installation. This is gallery quality work by any standard. Thank you, I said, though my voice lacked the enthusiasm the moment deserved. Trevor, can I ask you something? If I had to move out of my current studio space, would it affect my ability to create work at this level? He looked at me sharply. Are you thinking of moving? Maybe. Circumstances might change. Madison, the environment matters enormously for artists. The light, the space, the mental freedom from financial stress, all of that contributes to the quality of work you're producing. Could you create good art somewhere else? Of course. But would it be the same quality? That's harder to say. As guests began arriving for the opening that evening, I tried to push my housing anxieties aside and focus on the achievement at hand. The gallery filled with an impressive crowd. Collectors, local art enthusiasts, other artists, and journalists from regional arts publications. My family arrived fashionably late, looking slightly out of place among the wine-sipping art crowd. Mom wore her best dress, and the nervous smile she reserved for social situations where she wasn't sure of the etiquette. Dad kept checking his watch and commenting on the price tags. $1,200 for that one. I heard him whisper to Derek, pointing at one of my lake abstracts. Madison painted that in her basement. Caroline was more diplomatic, circulating through the crowd with a champagne glass and introducing herself as the artist's sister to anyone who would listen. But I caught her studying the paintings with an expression I couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or reassessment. The evening was a genuine success. I sold 4 pieces, collected contact information from several serious collectors, and received inquiries about future work. Trevor was practically glowing as he introduced me to gallery owners from other cities who might be interested in representing my work. "Madison, this is exactly what we hoped for," he said during a quiet moment. "You're officially a professional artist now." But as I watched my family navigate the opening, proud but slightly bewildered, supportive but clearly out of their element, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in two different worlds that were about to collide. Later that night, after the gallery had closed and the last guests had departed, my family and I sat in the lake house living room for a post-opening debrief. The contrast between the sophisticated gallery atmosphere and our family dynamic was jarring. "Well, that was certainly something," Mom said, settling into her favorite chair with a cup of tea. "I had no idea art people were so intense." "Did you see what they were charging for drinks?" Dad added. $15 for a glass of wine. "Highway robbery. The important thing is that Madison sold paintings," Caroline said diplomatically. "That's a real accomplishment. 4 paintings at over $1,000 each," Derek mused. "Not bad for a night's work." There was something in the way they discussed my success that bothered me, as if it were a lucky windfall rather than the culmination of months of dedicated work in ideal conditions. "It wasn't just luck," I said quietly. "I've been working incredibly hard, and having this space has made all the difference. The studio, the light, the mental freedom from financial stress, it all contributed to creating work at this level." Mom and Dad exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. "Madison," Dad said carefully, "we need to talk about something." The silence in the living room felt heavy as Dad gathered his thoughts. Mom was fidgeting with her teacup, Caroline was studying her manicure, and Derek was scrolling through his phone with the studied casualness of someone avoiding eye contact. I knew whatever was coming wasn't going to be good. "We've been approached about selling the house," Dad said finally, even though Bryce had warned me this was coming. Hearing it from my father's lips felt like a physical blow. "By whom?" "Bryce Peterson contacted us yesterday. He says he has a buyer willing to make a substantial offer. Enough to change our financial situation significantly." "How substantial?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Close to $1 million, Mom said quietly. "Maybe more with the right negotiations." The number hung in the air between us. $1 million. More than double what they'd paid for the house. Enough to transform their retirement plans. Enough to make any sentimental attachment to the property seem foolish. "So you're selling?" I tried to keep my voice neutral, but I could hear the tremor underneath. "We haven't decided anything yet," Dad said quickly. "But Madison, we have to consider it seriously. This kind of money doesn't come along often, especially for people our age who are trying to plan for retirement." Caroline leaned forward. "The buyer wants to close before the end of the year. That means we'd need to make a decision within the next few weeks." "And what does that mean for me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer to that too. Mom's voice was gentle but firm. "Well, obviously you'd need to find other living arrangements. But honey, you're doing so well now. Tonight proved that you can make a real living from your art. Maybe it's time to get your own place, start the next chapter of your life. With what money?" The question came out sharper than I intended. "Yes, I sold 4 paintings tonight, but that's maybe $5,000 after the gallery's commission. Do you know what it costs to rent a place with proper studio space? Do you know what it costs to live anywhere that has the kind of art community and collector base I need to build on tonight's success?" "Madison," Derek said, finally looking up from his phone, "you can't seriously expect Mom and Dad to turn down $1 million so you can keep living here rent-free." "I'm not living here rent-free," I snapped. "I maintain this property. I keep it secure. I handle all the day-to-day issues. I've saved you thousands of dollars in property management fees. And we've saved you thousands of dollars in rent," Caroline pointed out. "I'd say that makes us even." "Even." I stood up, pacing to the windows that overlooked the lake where moonlight was creating the kind of scene I'd painted dozens of times over the past 4 months. "I've built my entire artistic practice around this space. My studio, my routine, my professional connections, they're all here. You're not just asking me to move apartments. You're asking me to give up everything I've built. Nothing you've built here is going anywhere. Mom said. Your talent, your connections, your artistic skills, those belong to you. You can take them wherever you go. But can I recreate the conditions that allowed me to develop them in the first place? I turned back to face them. Do you think it's a coincidence that my work suddenly got good enough for gallery representation after I moved here? Do you think my artistic development happened in a vacuum? We think it happened because you finally had the time and space to focus on your art without financial stress, Dad said. And now you've proven that your art can generate income. Maybe it's time to see if you can sustain that success independently. Independently? The word felt like mockery. How could I be independent when everything I'd achieved was built on their generosity? How long do I have? I asked. The buyer wants to close by January 15th, Caroline said, consulting her phone. That gives you about 6 weeks to find a new place and move out. 6 weeks to dismantle the life I'd spent 4 months building. 6 weeks to find a new studio space, establish new routines, and maintain the momentum from tonight's opening while dealing with the upheaval of relocating. And where exactly am I supposed to go? My old apartment was rented the week after I moved out. The rental market in Cedar Falls is terrible, and anything comparable to this would cost more than I make in a year. Maybe you could find something smaller, Mom suggested. A nice one-bedroom with good light for painting. A one-bedroom. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, do you see the studio space? Do you see the storage, the natural light, the room to work on multiple large pieces simultaneously? You want me to go back to painting at my kitchen table? Madison, you're being dramatic, Derek said. Plenty of artists work in small spaces. It's about the art, not the studio. Says the person who's never created anything more complex than a PowerPoint presentation. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I was past caring about family diplomatic niceties. Hey, Derek's voice sharpened. I'm trying to be supportive here, but you're acting like we owe you this lifestyle forever. I'm not asking for forever. I'm asking for enough time to establish myself professionally so I can afford my own space like this. How much time? Dad asked. A year? 2 years? 5 years? Madison, we're not getting any younger, and this money could set us up for a comfortable retirement. What about my comfort? What about my career? The question hung in the air, and I realized how it sounded. Petulant, entitled, exactly the kind of selfish attitude they'd accused me of having months ago. Caroline sighed. Madison, I get that this is hard, but you have to understand this from Mom and Dad's perspective. They've given you an incredible opportunity. You've used it to build something amazing. Now it's time to take what you've learned and apply it to creating your own success. Easy for you to say. You've never had to choose between artistic development and financial survival, and you haven't had to choose either. For the past 4 months. Caroline shot back. You've had the luxury of pursuing your art without any of the constraints that most people deal with. Maybe it's time to see if your success is sustainable in the real world. The real world. As if this house, this life, this career I'd built wasn't real just because it was supported by family money. Fine, I said, feeling something cold and hard settling in my chest. You want to sell the house? Sell the house. Take your $1 million and enjoy your comfortable retirement. But don't pretend this is about what's best for me. And don't pretend you're not destroying something important. Madison, Mom's voice was pleading. We're not trying to destroy anything. We're trying to help you grow up. Grow up? The phrase hit me like a slap. I'm 28 years old. I just had a successful gallery opening. I'm building a legitimate art career. In what way am I not grown up? You're grown up when you can support yourself without relying on family subsidies, Dad said bluntly. You're grown up when you can maintain your lifestyle through your own efforts rather than our generosity. There it was, the truth they'd been dancing around. In their eyes, my success wasn't really mine because it was built on their foundation. My artistic achievements were diminished because they happened in luxury rather than struggle. So, the only way to prove I'm a real artist is to be poor and struggling. The only way to prove you're independent is to actually be independent, Caroline said. I looked around the room at my family, people who loved me, who had given me an incredible opportunity, who genuinely believed they were helping me by forcing me back into financial struggle. They couldn't understand that what they saw as dependence, I saw as partnership. What they saw as a subsidy, I saw as an investment in my artistic development. What if I paid rent? I asked suddenly. They all looked at me in surprise. What if I paid you market rate rent to stay here? Would that make this arrangement more acceptable to your sense of propriety? Madison, Dad said slowly, market rate rent on a house like this would be at least $3,000 a month. You made what? $5,000 tonight? Even if you sold 4 paintings every month, which would be extraordinary, you couldn't afford to live here. Then what if I paid what I can afford? Say $1,000 a month, that would cover utilities and some maintenance costs. Mom and Dad exchanged another look. Honey, Mom said gently, it's not about the money anymore. The buyer is offering us life-changing wealth. We can't turn that down so you can pay us $1,000 a month. So this was never really about teaching me independence or responsibility. It was about money. It's about practical reality, Dad said. We're in our 60s, Madison. This might be our only chance to secure our financial future. I felt something break inside me then. Not just disappointment, but a fundamental shift in how I saw my family and my place in their lives. For months, I'd been trying to prove that I wasn't selfish, that I could be grateful and responsible and deserving of their support. But none of that mattered when presented with a better financial opportunity. I understand, I said quietly. You're making a business decision. The house is an asset, and you're selling it to the highest bidder. I get it. Madison, don't make this sound cold and calculating, Mom protested. We love you, and we're proud of what you've accomplished here. But we have to think about our future too. Of course you do. And clearly your future doesn't include making space for my dreams. That's not fair, Caroline said. Your dreams aren't more important than Mom and Dad's financial security. I never said they were, but apparently their financial security is more important than my artistic development. Your artistic development will continue wherever you live, Derek said. Art isn't about the building you create it in. Spoken like someone who's never tried to create anything meaningful. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the couch. I need some air. Madison, where are you going? Mom called, as I headed for the door. For a walk, to think about how I'm going to dismantle my life in 6 weeks so you can cash out your investment. I walked out into the cold November night, leaving my family sitting in the living room of the house that would soon belong to a tech executive from Minneapolis. The lake was dark and still, reflecting stars that seemed impossibly distant. As I walked down to the dock, I realized that this moment had been inevitable from the beginning. I'd been living in someone else's dream, built my success on someone else's foundation, and convinced myself that it was sustainable. But houses are investments, families have priorities, and daughters who are called selfish for wanting independence don't get to keep paradise forever. The question now was what I was going to do about it. Accept their decision gracefully and try to rebuild elsewhere. Fight for more time and risk damaging family relationships permanently, or find a way to make staying here impossible to refuse. Standing on that dock, looking at the house that had become my sanctuary, I realized that my family's accusations about my selfishness had been wrong in one important way. I hadn't been nearly selfish enough. But that was about to change. I spent 3 sleepless hours on that dock, and by the time I went back inside, I had a plan. My family was long asleep, probably dreaming of million-dollar bank deposits and comfortable retirements. They had no idea what their selfish daughter was capable of when her back was truly against the wall. The next morning, I called Trevor before anyone else was awake. Madison, it's barely 7 a.m. Is everything all right? I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If I had to move out of this studio space in 6 weeks, what would that do to my career trajectory? There was a long pause. Madison, what's going on? My family is selling the house. I need to know if there's any way to prevent that from happening. Selling? But you just had your breakthrough show. This is the worst possible timing. I know. So tell me honestly, could I maintain this level of artistic production working out of a cramped apartment? No, Trevor said bluntly. I mean, you're talented enough that you'd create good work anywhere. But the pieces you've been producing here have a sophistication that comes from having proper space, proper light, and freedom from financial stress. It would be very difficult to replicate those conditions elsewhere, especially on an artist's budget. What if I could find a way to stay? Madison, I don't understand. If your family is selling, what if they couldn't sell? Another pause. Longer this time. What exactly are you asking me? I'm asking hypothetically. If there were legal complications that prevented or delayed a sale, would that be beneficial for my career? Madison, I can't advise you to do anything that might cause legal problems for your family. I'm not asking you to advise me. I'm asking you to tell me what would be best for my artistic development. Staying here for at least another year would be ideal. Your work is just hitting its stride, and disrupting that momentum could set you back significantly. Thank you for being honest. After hanging up, I made my second call to a lawyer I'd found through an online search. Janet Morrison specialized in real estate law and had excellent reviews for handling complex property disputes. Ms. Morrison, I need to understand something about tenant rights in Minnesota. If someone has been living in a property for several months, contributing to its maintenance and upkeep, do they have any legal protections against sudden eviction? That depends on several factors. Do you have a written lease agreement? No, but I have documentation of my contributions to property maintenance, utility payments I've made, and evidence that this has been my primary residence for 4 months. Interesting. In some circumstances, you might be able to establish tenancy rights even without a formal lease. You'd need to prove that you've been living there with the owner's knowledge and consent, that you've contributed to the property's upkeep, and that you have a reasonable expectation of continued residency. And if I could prove those things, you might be entitled to proper notice before eviction, typically 30 to 60 days, and if you could demonstrate that eviction would cause you significant financial hardship or damage to your livelihood, a court might be willing to extend that timeline. How much would it cost to explore this legally? My retainer is $1,500. But Miss Whitmore, I should warn you that pursuing this route could damage your relationship with your family permanently. My relationship with my family is already damaged. They're choosing money over my future. I see. Well, if you'd like to proceed, I can review your documentation and give you a more detailed assessment of your options. My third call was to a local reporter named Amy Chen, who covered arts and culture for the regional newspaper. I'd met her at my gallery opening, and she'd expressed interest in doing a feature story about my artistic journey. Amy, it's Madison Whitmore. We talked about an interview yesterday. Of course! I was hoping you'd call. I'd love to do a piece about your success story, local artists make good. That sort of thing. Actually, I was hoping we could discuss a different angle. What would you say to a story about how family dynamics can either support or sabotage an artist's career? That's more complex. What did you have in mind? I'm facing eviction from the studio space where I created all the work in this show. My family is selling the property I've been living in, with only 6 weeks' notice, despite knowing that this will destroy my ability to continue working at this level. That's a compelling human interest angle. Artists struggling with housing insecurity is definitely a relevant story right now. It gets more interesting. The space I'm losing is my family's vacation home. They're evicting me to sell to a wealthy out-of-state buyer, even though my presence there has been beneficial to the property and my art has brought positive attention to the local gallery scene. Wow, that's actually a much bigger story than I initially thought. Would you be willing to go on record with details? Absolutely. And Amy? I think there might be public interest in understanding how gentrification and real estate speculation affect working artists, even when it's driven by their own families. By the time my family came downstairs for breakfast, I had set 3 different plans in motion. I made coffee and scrambled eggs as if nothing had changed, humming softly while I cooked. You're in a good mood this morning, Mom observed, settling at the kitchen island with her mug. I've been thinking about our conversation last night, and I realize you're absolutely right. Dad looked up from his phone with surprise. We are? Yes, it's time for me to stop being selfish and start thinking about what's best for everyone. Caroline, who had just wandered in wearing yoga clothes, raised an eyebrow. That's not the reaction I was expecting. I've been so focused on my own artistic development that I wasn't considering the bigger picture. You deserve to benefit from your investment, and I need to learn to succeed independently. Madison, that's very mature of you, Mom said, though she sounded slightly suspicious of my sudden reasonableness. In fact, I've decided to help make the transition as smooth as possible. I've already started making calls about alternative living arrangements. Really? Derek had appeared in the doorway looking skeptical. Like what? Well, I called a lawyer to understand my options, just to make sure I handle everything properly from a legal standpoint. The room went very quiet. What kind of lawyer? Dad asked slowly. A real estate attorney. I wanted to make sure that my months of residence here don't create any complications for your sale. You know, tenant rights issues, that sort of thing. Madison. Mom's voice had taken on a warning tone. You don't have tenant rights. This was a family arrangement. Oh, I'm sure you're right. But given the amount of money involved, I thought it would be responsible to get professional guidance. I've documented all my contributions to property maintenance, my utility payments, and my established residency. The lawyer said it's always better to be thorough in these situations. You hired a lawyer to fight us on this. Caroline's voice was incredulous. Not to fight you, to protect everyone's interests. Did you know that if a sale gets challenged on grounds of improper eviction, it can delay closing for months? I'd hate for your buyer to get frustrated and walk away because of procedural issues. Dad's face was turning red. Madison, are you threatening us? Of course not. I'm being responsible. Just like you taught me. I smiled sweetly and refilled their coffee cups. I also called that reporter from last night. She's doing a feature story about my artistic journey, and she was fascinated by the angle of how real estate pressures affect working artists. What reporter? Mom asked. Amy Chen from the Tribune. She said the story of a family selling their daughter's art studio to out-of-state investors has real human interest appeal, especially given how much my work has contributed to the local art scene. Madison, stop. Dad's voice was sharp. What exactly are you doing? I'm being selfish, I said simply. You've spent months telling me that's what I am, so I've decided to embrace it fully. I pulled out my phone and showed them the screen, where I'd been typing notes. I've documented every conversation we've had about my living situation, every family gathering where you've criticized my lifestyle choices, every time you've called me selfish for wanting independence. It's amazing how different those conversations sound when you consider that I was actually contributing to property maintenance while living in substandard conditions in my apartment. You weren't living in substandard conditions by choice, Derek protested. You were struggling financially. Exactly, which makes this house's contribution to my artistic development even more significant. A struggling artist finally gets space to flourish, creates work that brings recognition to the local gallery scene, then gets evicted by her own family for financial gain. It's not that simple, Caroline said. Isn't it? You're selling my home, because that's what this legally is after 4 months of residency, to maximize your profit. I'm being displaced so you can cash out your investment. Madison, this is our house, Mom said firmly. Is it? Because I've been paying utilities, maintaining the property, and using it as my primary residence for 4 months. According to my lawyer, that establishes certain rights regardless of whose name is on the deed. Your lawyer is wrong, Dad said. Maybe. We'll find out. Minnesota tenant law is apparently quite protective of people who've established residency, even without formal leases, especially when they can demonstrate financial investment in the property. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared earlier. I've documented every grocery run where I stocked the house, every utility bill I've contributed to, every maintenance task I've performed, every improvement I've made to the studio space. I've also calculated the market value of property management services I've provided, about $800 per month. This is ridiculous, Caroline said. You can't seriously think you can stop this sale. I don't need to stop it permanently. I just need to delay it long enough to establish my career more firmly. My lawyer thinks 6 months would be reasonable, maybe more if I can demonstrate ongoing financial hardship from displacement. And the reporter? Mom asked quietly. Well, that's separate. The story of local artists being displaced by gentrification and family greed is just good journalism. Especially when it involves a vacation home being sold to out-of-state wealth while the local artist who made it productive gets evicted. The silence in the kitchen was deafening. Finally, Dad spoke. What do you want, Madison? 2 years, I said without hesitation. 2 years to establish my career firmly enough that I can afford my own space. In exchange, I'll pay you $1,500 a month in rent, fair market value for what I'm actually using. $1,500 a month for a house worth $1 million. Derek scoffed. $1,500 a month for a basement studio and a bedroom with shared common spaces. That's actually above market rate for that much space. The buyer won't wait 2 years, Caroline pointed out. Then you'll need to find a different buyer. Or find a way to make this one wait. Madison, Mom's voice was pleading. This is our retirement security you're playing with. And this is my career you were planning to destroy. I guess we all have to make choices about what matters most. I stood up and refilled my coffee cup, completely calm. The interesting thing about being called selfish for so long is that eventually you realize it might not be such a bad thing. Selfish people protect their interests. Selfish people don't sacrifice their futures for other people's convenience. Selfish people fight for what they've built. This is extortion, Derek said. No, this is negotiation. Extortion would be if I threatened to expose something damaging about you. I'm just protecting my legal rights as a tenant and sharing my story with interested media. And if we refuse, Dad asked, then I'll see you in court, and you can explain to a judge why you think it's reasonable to evict your daughter with 6 weeks' notice to maximize your profit from a vacation home sale. I smiled at them all. The smile I'd learned from watching Caroline manipulate family dynamics for years. The really beautiful part is that by calling me selfish all these months, you've actually given me permission to act in my own self-interest. So thank you for that lesson. Mom was staring at me like she'd never seen me before. Madison, this isn't you. Actually, Mom, this is exactly me. This is what I look like when I stop apologizing for wanting things and start fighting for them. 3 weeks later, we signed a 2-year rental agreement. The buyer, faced with potential legal delays and negative media coverage, had agreed to wait. My family was furious but trapped by their own previous accusations about my character. They'd called me selfish for wanting independence when I was struggling. They'd never imagined what I'd be capable of when I embraced that selfishness with privilege and legal backing behind it. As I signed the lease agreement that secured my home and studio for the next 2 years, I realized they'd been right about one thing. I was selfish. I just wasn't the kind of selfish they'd expected. Sometimes the people who know you best are the ones who understand you least. My family thought they knew exactly who I was. The struggling artist who would always choose principle over pragmatism. The daughter who would never fight back effectively. They learned too late that living in their dream home had taught me to dream bigger than they'd ever imagined. The weeks following our rental agreement were a masterclass in power dynamics. I never thought I'd need to understand. My family's resentment was palpable but carefully controlled. They'd learned that their selfish daughter now had both legal protection and media connections. Derek stopped visiting entirely, claiming he was too busy with work to make the drive. Caroline maintained a veneer of sisterly support, but her conversations became stiff and formal, peppered with passive-aggressive comments about family loyalty and burning bridges. She'd call occasionally to check in, but always ended our talks with subtle digs about my new attitude, or questions about whether I was happy with the choices I'd made. My parents were more complex in their response. Dad oscillated between grudging respect and barely concealed anger. One day he'd call to ask about a maintenance issue with genuine concern. The next he'd make cutting remarks about my legal maneuvering and how I'd learned to play hardball. Mom seemed genuinely hurt, as if my willingness to fight for my interests had somehow betrayed the daughter she thought she'd raised. "I just don't understand where this calculating side of you came from," she said during one particularly tense phone conversation. "This isn't how we raised you to handle family disputes. You raised me to be accommodating and agreeable," I replied, arranging the latest commission pieces in my studio. "But you also taught me to watch how successful people operate. Turns out, successful people don't usually achieve their goals by being accommodating. We didn't teach you to manipulate your own family. No, you taught me that by example." Every Sunday dinner guilt trip, every suggestion about my life choices, every time you framed your preferences as what was best for me, that was all manipulation. I just learned to do it more effectively. The silence on her end told me the truth of that statement had hit home. But the most interesting change was in how the local community began treating me. Word had spread about my tenant rights victory, and other artists started reaching out for advice about housing situations and dealing with difficult landlords. I'd accidentally become a symbol of artist advocacy, someone who'd successfully fought back against displacement. Trevor noticed the shift immediately. "You've become something of a local legend," he told me during one of our regular check-ins. "Half the artists in the county are talking about how you stood up to family pressure, and won. It's actually enhanced your reputation rather than damaged it." I never intended for it to become public knowledge. Madison, that reporter's article was picked up by 3 other publications. The story of an artist using legal strategy to protect her studio space resonated with a lot of people. "You're not just seen as talented anymore, you're seen as smart and determined." This reputation boost translated into unexpected opportunities. A gallery in Minneapolis reached out about representing my work. A wealthy collector from Chicago commissioned a series of large-scale pieces, specifically because, as she put it, "I admire artists who fight for their craft." An arts foundation invited me to speak at a symposium about housing challenges facing emerging artists. My waiting list for commissioned work stretched 6 months out, and my prices had doubled since the gallery opening. The financial security I'd craved for years was finally materializing, built on the foundation of the very selfishness my family had condemned. But success at this level brought its own complications. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a battleground I'd won but couldn't fully enjoy. Every family gathering was tense with unspoken resentment. Every shared meal carried undertones of the legal warfare that had preceded our current arrangement. Christmas was particularly awkward. The extended family arrived as planned, and I found myself in the surreal position of playing host in a house where half the people resented my presence. Aunt Helen made pointed comments about young people who don't appreciate family generosity. Uncle Jim kept asking intrusive questions about my legal situation with the obvious hope that I'd incriminate myself somehow. The children, thankfully, were oblivious to the adult tensions. They loved having an artist in residence, and I spent hours teaching my cousin's kids basic painting techniques in my studio. Their enthusiasm for art reminded me why I'd fought so hard to preserve this space in the first place. "Aunt Madison, will you always live in the pretty house by the water?" asked 7-year-old Emma during one of our painting sessions. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I'll live here as long as I can create beautiful things in this room." "Good. I like your paintings better than the ones in Grammy's house." Out of the mouths of babes. The holidays also brought an unexpected revelation. While organizing papers for my accountant, I discovered documentation that my parents had been claiming tax deductions for the lake house as a rental property for the past 2 years, including the period when it sat empty before I moved in. They'd been benefiting financially from characterizing it as an investment property rather than a pure vacation home. When I brought this up with my lawyer, Janet Morrison whistled low. "This strengthens your position considerably. If they've been treating it as rental property for tax purposes, it supports your claim to tenant protections. They can't have it both ways, claiming rental deductions while denying rental obligations." I decided not to confront my parents directly with this information. Instead, I filed it away as insurance, a card to play if they ever tried to challenge our rental agreement or force me out before the 2-year term ended. By spring, the dynamics had settled into a cold but functional routine. My parents used the house about once a month, usually giving me several days' notice. During their visits, we maintained polite civility, while carefully avoiding any discussion of our legal arrangement or the circumstances that had created it. I used their absence to establish new routines and connections. I hosted small gatherings for local artists, organized painting workshops for tourists, and even started renting out studio space to visiting artists during peak season. The basement that had once been my private sanctuary became a modest but profitable creative hub. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now generating income from the same space my family had been eager to sell for quick profit. My artist residency program brought cultural tourists to the area, my workshops filled local businesses with visitors, and my growing reputation drew art collectors to the region. I was contributing to the local economy in ways that a wealthy vacation homeowner never would. During one of our check-ins, Trevor made an observation that crystallized something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. "You know, Madison, you've essentially become what your parents thought they were buying when they purchased this house." "What do you mean?" "They bought a dream of creative fulfillment, artistic accomplishment, and cultural sophistication, but they were never going to achieve that through ownership alone. You've actually lived that dream, made it productive, turned their investment into something culturally significant." He was right. My parents had bought the house hoping it would transform their lives, make them feel more cultured and accomplished. But houses don't confer sophistication. The people who inhabit them do. I'd given their investment meaning and purpose beyond mere real estate appreciation. As summer approached and my first year in the house neared its end, I began planning for the long term. My 2-year lease was secure, but I wanted more than just temporary stability. I wanted to build something lasting. I started researching property ownership options, exploring whether there might be a path to actually purchasing the house rather than just renting it. My income had grown substantially, and there were grants and financing programs specifically designed to help artists acquire studio properties. More importantly, I'd begun documenting the cultural and economic impact of my residency in the house. The tourist revenue from my workshops, the visiting artists who brought business to local hotels and restaurants, the media attention that positioned Crystal Lake as an emerging arts destination. All of this could be quantified and presented as evidence that keeping me in the house was beneficial for the entire community. When I finally broached the subject with my parents during a carefully planned conversation in late June, their reaction was predictably resistant. "Madison, the house is worth nearly $1 million, Dad said. Even if you qualified for artist financing, you couldn't possibly afford the payments. Actually, I've run the numbers with several lenders. With my current income and the tax benefits available for artist-owned studios, I could potentially manage it, especially if we structured it as a rent-to-own arrangement over several years." "But why would we do that when we could sell it for full market value?" "Because full market value assumes you find another buyer willing to pay top dollar. The original buyer walked away when faced with legal complications and negative publicity. Those issues don't disappear just because our rental agreement expires." Mom looked uncomfortable. "Madison, are you threatening us again?" "I'm being practical. I've established tenant rights, built a business here, and created community connections. Any future sale is going to have to account for those realities. Meanwhile, I'm offering you a path to long-term financial benefit without the risks and complications of finding new buyers." The conversation didn't reach resolution that day, but I could see them processing the implications. They'd wanted to treat the house purely as a financial asset, but my presence had made it more complicated than that. I wasn't just a tenant they could easily replace. I was an integral part of what made the property valuable. By the end of my first year, I'd achieved something I never thought possible. I'd turned my family's accusation of selfishness into the foundation of genuine independence. Not the independence of struggling alone, but the independence of building something sustainable and valuable that others had to respect. The girl who'd once apologized for wanting her own space had become a woman who commanded respect for the space she'd created. The daughter, who'd been called selfish for pursuing her art, had learned to be selfish in ways that protected and advanced her artistic career. And sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is refuse to be ashamed of taking up space in the world. The second year brought unexpected challenges that tested every strategy I'd developed. In August, Derek got engaged to his longtime girlfriend Sarah, and they announced their intention to have a destination wedding at the lake house the following spring. The family was thrilled. Finally, a celebration that would showcase the property in all its glory. But planning a wedding while I lived there full-time created logistical nightmares that no one had anticipated. Derek and Sarah wanted to redecorate the common areas, hire vendors for extensive landscaping, and transform the basement into a bridal preparation suite for the weekend. Every conversation about wedding plans became an indirect negotiation about my rights as a tenant versus their rights as family. "Madison, you have to understand that this is Derek's wedding," Caroline explained during one particularly heated family conference call. "Surely you can be flexible about studio access for one weekend." "I'm absolutely willing to be flexible," I replied, standing in the very basement they wanted to commandeer. "But I have 3 commissioned pieces due the week after the wedding, and I need access to my workspace and equipment." "We can share the space, but I can't vacate it entirely." "It's just one weekend," Mom pleaded. "It's actually the entire week leading up to the wedding, plus cleanup time after. And what happens if something gets damaged or paint fumes contaminate my canvases? Who's responsible for replacing thousands of dollars worth of artwork?" The wedding planning revealed how thoroughly I'd integrated my life into the house. My art supplies were organized throughout the basement storage areas. My commission schedules were built around predictable, quiet periods. My professional equipment was calibrated for the specific lighting and space configurations I'd established. Moving everything temporarily wasn't just inconvenient, it was professionally disruptive in ways my family couldn't understand. "Can't you just paint somewhere else for a week?" Derek asked with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never tried to create anything more complex than a spreadsheet. "Can you just get married somewhere else?" I shot back, then immediately regretted the harshness of my response. But Derek's expression shifted to something calculating. "Actually, Madison, we could. Sarah's parents have offered to pay for a venue in Minneapolis. The only reason we're doing it here is because Mom and Dad wanted to showcase the house." "Derek," Dad's voice carried a warning tone. "No, I'm serious. If Madison's art projects are more important than family celebrations, maybe we should reconsider the whole plan." I realized I was being maneuvered into a position where I'd either have to concede completely or be blamed for ruining Derek's wedding. It was a masterclass in family manipulation that made my own legal strategies look amateur by comparison. "I never said my work was more important than Derek's wedding," I said carefully. "I said I need reasonable accommodation for both things to coexist. That's what adults do. They find solutions that work for everyone." What followed was 2 weeks of intense negotiation that involved rental agreements for temporary studio space, insurance policies for my artwork, and detailed schedules for shared basement access. By the time we reached a compromise, I'd spent more time on wedding logistics than the actual bride. But the process taught me something valuable about my position in the family dynamic. They needed my cooperation more than I needed their approval. The house had become so associated with my artistic presence that Derek and Sarah's photographer specifically requested access to my studio for authentic creative atmosphere shots. Wedding guests were asking about the resident artist and whether my work would be available for purchase. I'd become part of the property's appeal, not just its tenant. The wedding weekend itself was surprisingly pleasant. Sarah turned out to be genuinely interested in my work, and several wedding guests commissioned pieces after seeing my studio. Derek, perhaps mellowed by matrimonial bliss, actually thanked me for making the space feel cultural and sophisticated. "You know, Maddie," he said during the reception, slightly drunk on champagne and sentiment, "when you first moved in here, I thought you were just being stubborn about independence. But seeing how you've made this place come alive, I get it now." It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. Progress. The wedding also attracted unexpected attention from the arts community. One of the guests was Margaret Thornfield, a wealthy philanthropist who funded emerging artist programs throughout the Midwest. She spent an hour in my studio, examining my work with the practiced eye of someone who'd built a significant contemporary art collection. "Madison, have you considered applying for the Thornfield Foundation's Artist Property Grant?" she asked as she studied a particularly complex lake abstraction. "I'm not familiar with that program. We provide funding to help established artists purchase properties that have proven crucial to their creative development. The goal is to prevent displacement and ensure long-term artistic stability." She handed me her card. "The application process is rigorous, but based on what I've seen here and what I've heard about your advocacy work, you'd be a strong candidate. The grants can cover up to 60% of property purchase costs." That night, after the last wedding guest had departed and my family had returned to their respective homes, I sat on the dock researching the Thornfield Foundation. Their artist property grants were substantial, enough to make purchasing the lake house financially feasible if my parents were willing to sell at a reasonable price. More importantly, the foundation's criteria emphasized artists who demonstrated that specific properties were essential to their creative development. My documentation of how the lake house had transformed my work, combined with my established residency and business operations, made me an ideal candidate. For the first time since moving in, I began to envision a future where this wouldn't just be a temporary sanctuary but a permanent home. I spent the next month preparing my grant application, a process that required me to articulate exactly how the house had changed my art and why preserving that connection was crucial for my continued development. Writing the essays forced me to reflect on my transformation over the past 18 months. The girl who'd moved in with a few $1,000s and a desperate need for studio space had become a woman generating six-figure annual income from art sales. The daughter who'd been called selfish for wanting independence had built a small business that employed other artists and contributed to the local economy. Most significantly, the person who'd once apologized for taking up space had learned to advocate for the space she needed to thrive. My application emphasized not just my individual success, but the broader cultural impact of artist-owned properties. I documented how my residency had attracted other artists to the area, increased cultural tourism, and established Crystal Lake as an emerging arts destination. I provided testimonials from local business owners who'd benefited from the increased foot traffic my workshops and events generated. The foundation's site visit in November was more thorough than I'd expected. Margaret Thornfield returned with 2 other board members, an arts administrator, and a property assessor. They spent an entire day reviewing my work, examining my documentation of the house's impact on my artistic development, and interviewing local community members about the cultural and economic benefits of my presence. "Madison," Margaret said as they concluded their visit, "I have to say this is one of the most compelling applications we've seen. You've done something remarkable here. You've demonstrated that artist residencies aren't just beneficial for the artists, but for entire communities. Does that mean I'm likely to receive funding? I can't make promises, but your application addresses every criterion we look for: demonstrated artistic growth, property-specific creative development, community impact, and long-term sustainability planning. The decision will be made by the full board in January." January, just as my lease was entering its final year. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents had evolved into something resembling mutual respect, if not warmth. They'd begun to understand that my success wasn't just about the house itself, but about what I'd built within it. More importantly, they'd started to see financial benefits from my presence that went beyond simple rent payments. My artist residency programs brought steady income through workshop fees and studio rentals. My growing reputation attracted art collectors and cultural tourists who stayed at local hotels, ate at local restaurants, and bought from local shops. Property values in the area had increased partly due to the cultural amenities my presence represented. "You know," Dad said during one of his monthly property inspections, "when we first bought this place, I imagined it would make us feel more sophisticated, more cultured. And now, I realize that culture isn't something you can buy. It's something you create, or something you support others in creating. It wasn't quite an admission that selling the house would have been a mistake, but it was recognition that my fight to stay had produced benefits they hadn't anticipated. Mom's evolution was more gradual, but perhaps more meaningful. She'd started referring to my studio as Madison's workspace rather than the basement. And she'd begun bringing friends to see my art when they visited. During one memorable conversation, she even admitted that my legal maneuvering had taught her something about standing up for herself in other areas of her life. "I've been thinking about what you said, about how we taught you manipulation by example," she said one evening, as we prepared dinner together. "And I realized you were right. I spent years saying things like, it would make me happy if instead of just saying what I wanted directly. It's a hard pattern to break. You broke it though. Maybe not gracefully at first, but you learned to advocate for yourself clearly and effectively." As December approached, marking nearly 2 years since I'd first moved into the lake house, I found myself reflecting on the person I'd become. The transformation hadn't been comfortable or easy, but it had been necessary. I've learned that being called selfish by people who love you isn't always an accusation. Sometimes it's permission to prioritize your own growth and happiness. I'd discovered that family dynamics can be rewritten when you're willing to risk disapproval to establish new terms. Most importantly, I'd realized that the choice isn't between being selfish and being selfless, but between being passive and being purposeful. The Thornfield Foundation's decision would come in January, but regardless of the outcome, I'd already achieved something more valuable than property ownership. I'd learned to take up space in the world without apologizing for it, to fight for what I needed without feeling guilty about it, and to build something meaningful even when the foundation wasn't entirely my own. The lake house had taught me to be selfish in the most profound way possible. Selfish enough to believe I deserved a beautiful life, and strategic enough to create one. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.